Hello, and it's time for Preshift again. Hey, I'm Dylan Higgins, and we're doing Preshift beverage training. If you've been watching the videos, I'm sure you're aware that that's the theme here. The idea being that you've got about 10 minutes to get some information into that skull of yours so you can go out and hopefully help some guests enjoy the rest of their evening, or maybe you've got customers that come through a grocery store and you're trying to help them figure out and understand what they're doing a little bit better. So that's the whole point of this. Today we're gonna spend about 10 minutes. It's about how much time I feel like you should probably allocate to beverage training every day, to learning a bit more about beer. There will be two very prevalent themes over the course of this course, if you will. And one of them is that beer is a very important component of the conversation. Wine is another component of the conversation that's super important. There's a whole bunch of stuff that that is derived from those two things, and that's why it's important to know about them. So we're going to start with beer today. Beer's huge. There's a giant market for it. A, B, it's so complex. We can spend all day talking about yeast. We can spend all day talking about hops. We can spend all day talking about ale versus lager, and we will get to all those things. But it takes time. So this is the very basic intro of that. And again, like I said, there'll be a lot of themes that I'll touch on in here that we'll then explore in greater detail later. The same concept will happen with wine. Wine might actually take longer just because so many varietals, but beside the point. All right, so beer is the fermented alcoholic beverage that comes from fermenting cereal grains. Now, we've been doing that for thousands of years, and if you want to look specifically at something as a date where the modern beer industry started, it's probably easiest to look at 1516 when the Bavarian purity law was passed. It's called the Reinheitsgebot. You'll also find that I spent a lot of time unnecessarily stating German words. Most of the German words associated with the beverage industry are fascinating, if not really fun to say. So the Reinheitsgebot is the Bavarian purity law of 1516. It was always sort of assumed that everybody knew that yeast plus cereal grains plus water equaled beer. So they left yeast off of the list of things that you needed to have. And they also didn't, I'm assuming they didn't think that they could actually regulate yeast to an extent, because they didn't put it on there as a thing that needed to be listed as a pure ingredient. So we will often refer to the four basic things that you need to make beer, but again, the assumption seems to have been that yeast was one of them. The other three are water, which is hugely important. If you think that water doesn't impact your beer, your whiskey, anything along those lines, you're incorrect. Water makes up the bulk of the body of those things, and so we need to make sure that it's pure and that it's in good shape if we're putting it in our bottles and then subsequently in ourselves. The other two things are the actual grain that needs to be mashed, and it was effectively ruled out that you had to use barley. And there are two types of barley. I'll probably actually spend an entire 10 minutes just talking about barley. It's that important. Anyway, so barley, or whatever grain you're going to use, and there are a few of those, and then water, yeast, and a bittering agent. And a lot of people used all kinds of different things. There's the whole process of making an amaro or a digestivo involves local bittering agents. So in the world of beer, there were a lot of them, and the Reinheitsgebot sought to sort of streamline that process and eliminate everything except for hops. There's still a lot of types of hops. We'll probably do an entire episode just on hops. So don't think that by narrowing the field to hops that they really limited the situation. They didn't. That being said, there are really still two types of beer that come out of that. Ales and lagers. Ales are the one that you'll find in the greatest amount of production so far as microbrews go. And the reason for that is because the yeast that is used to produce ale, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, is a little more tolerant to heat. It's also a little more tolerant to higher alcohol content. And as such, it's a lot easier to build a facility wherein that yeast will thrive and do its job well and give you good beer. The other primary type of beer is called lager. Lager actually is derived from the German word for storage vessel, I want to say. So effectively, it just means a stored beer. But the thing is, lager is produced with Saccharomyces pastorianus, which is a substantially less tolerant yeast to heat and alcohol content, so it has to be kept cold. So cold fermented, cold aged, cold filtered, the whole 9 yards. That may sound similar to somebody's advertising campaign from like 25 years ago, and there's a reason for that. Anyway, lager is actually the one that we produce the most. It's the one with the least complexity in general. It's usually much cleaner and lighter because it has to be kept cold, so you wind up chill filtering, you wind up doing all the things that remove a lot of impurities. On the one side, that's really hard to achieve. On the other hand, if you do get that formula down, you can make a really solid, very pure beer. And that's really the point here. So, under types, ales, there's so many subsets of ale. Technically speaking, stouts are an ale. So are Scotch beer, barley wine, IPAs, amber ales, golden ales. There are ales for days. And under lagers, there are fewer of them, but Oktoberfest beers, Schwarzbier, Bocks, Dunkels, all of these are produced in a lager style. And we'll get into that in greater detail on the lager day and on the ale day. But at the end of the day, we're talking about beer in general. So let's go over really quickly the primary grains that are used. Mostly it's barley, and there's a lot of reasons for that. One of the primary one being that amylase is present in barley, and so you can actually develop the starches into sugars and begin the fermentation process without having to add enzymes. That becomes hugely important when we talk about some distilled spirits too. Anywho, so barley is the primary one, and then we talk about some filler grains like corn and wheat. Corn and rice. Wheat is actually probably the second most prevalent base grain for making beer. If you're looking at Hefeweizen, for example, is a wheat beer. And as you'll notice, they're cloudy, and there's a reason for that, and we'll get into that when it comes time. And then when we talk about yeast, again, there's just the two primary forms of yeast, though many beers do encounter, not many, some beers encounter an additional strain of yeast called Brettanomyces. Brettanomyces is usually described as adding like a funky element to beers and wines, and we'll get into that in greater detail. And there's also Lactobacillus, which is actually not a yeast, but is rather a bacteria that converts a lot of things into lactic acid. So there's that. Hops being the final piece of the puzzle. Hops are the flowers of the hops plant, which is Humulus lupulus. It's a member of the hemp family. They are used to flavor and stabilize beers. They have a natural antimicrobial activity, which helps to make sure that you're serving pure beer. Plus, it gives a bittering flavor, or a citrusy flavor, or a floral flavor, depending on which hop you're using. and usually that helps add some character. Anyway, beer is huge. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about beer. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about wine. You guys are going to get tired of seeing me talk about those two things. Anyway, hope all's well. I hope you have great service tonight, and I'll talk to you soon.